Welcome back to Sensible 2020. I am your event host, Seth Adler. I am very pleased and honored to be in that role. Decolonizing drug use. Your moderator is Oriana Mayorga. Without further ado, Oriana.
Hey everyone, my name is Oriana Mayorga, and I will be moderating Decolonizing Drug Use, positioning our movement to combat imperialism. And today I have 4 other incredible panelists joining me. I'll invite each of them to introduce themselves for about 2 minutes, and we'll dive right in. Can we start off with Dom, please?
Good day to everyone. My name is Dominique Coronel. I'm an activist, community organizer, and student from Chicago, Illinois. I serve on the board of directors of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit called People for Sensible Drug Culture, and I'm really happy to be here today.
My name is Ismail Ali. I've been working in the drug policy and criminal justice reform space for about 6 years, first at the ACLU in 2015, and then for the last 4 years or so now, with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, as its policy council. I served as the chair of the board of directors for SSDP for 2 years prior to the last round of the last election, and I'm also excited to be here.
Hey everyone, this is Jason Ortiz. I'm the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. I first got my start in drug policy when I was arrested for cannabis possession in high school back in 2000. And ever since then, I've been a cannabis activist to try to end the war on drugs. And I was lucky enough to go to the University of Connecticut, where I joined SSDP and was in SSDP for my full time there, served on the board. But now I work to try to change cannabis policies to make sure that those communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs also benefit from the legalization of cannabis. And so I'm excited to talk about how we can make that happen, not just here in the States, but across the globe.
My name again is Oriana Mayorga. I am a full-time student at Union Theological Seminary, where I'm studying to get my master's in divinity. And recently I was elected to be the vice chair for SSDP, the board of directors, thanks to Dom and many other directors on the board. And I'm really happy to be here today with you all. So let's just dive right in. We know that drug prohibition, and by extension, the entire global drug system, was developed as a tool of colonialism. And whether it's the erasure of indigenous lands and culture, violent oppression against people of African descent, or religious intolerance against minority populations, drug prohibition has often been implemented as a cover for imperialist powers to continue subjugating the rest of the world by colonial rule. And I'm curious if any of our panelists could start us off with defining a bit either colonialism or imperialism, and sharing how you see these terms apply to our current state of drug prohibition.
Yeah, I'll start off. And so colonialism is, in general, the act of one nation or group of people taking control over and forcing their will on another group of people. And this is normally done through nation states, so one country taking over another. And so we have examples of that today, you know, things like Puerto Rico, which is where my family is from, is currently colonized by the United States. And this has been going on for many years, hundreds of years. And so colonialism is directly related to imperialism, which is similar but a little bit different, of countries exporting their desires and will across the globe and forcing other countries to bend to what they want to do. And so we've seen that happen throughout the Latin American countries with Spain earlier on, and a little bit more so now with the United States. And so the way I understand it is colonialism is when the entity wants to make that relationship permanent. They bring settlers in, they take control of local communities, and they start to exploit it economically. So there's a financial piece there. But imperialism can happen to any country at any time. Anyone that was victim of, you know, European powers that came and started to enslave folks were victims of imperialism, even though only certain countries are the sort of the suffering under colonialism specifically, which is a continuous situation. So, you know, we have examples of both throughout history, and it's been clear that drug policy has been used to both take over political situations, but also on a eliminating opposition standpoint. Whenever there's communities that want to rise up, drug policies have been used to squash those movements. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from history of how we got here, and also a lot we can do to actually make it a better place than we see it right now.
Thank you for that, Jason. Dom or Ismail, would either one of you want to add a bit more about imperialism or colonialism, specifically in the context of drug prohibition?
I would just say that it is our responsibility as drug policy reformers to talk about prohibition in a global context and how the global war on drugs has been used by the United States and other imperialistic countries and governments for hegemonic and colonial efforts. And I also think, and I hope that we talk about during this panel, efforts to decolonize the drug policy reform movement and continue to fight white-centric forms of organizing and lack of representation of marginalized groups in our own networks and organizations. I believe that through a multi-class, multi-generational, multiracial, multicultural movement, can we effectively build enough collective power to change drug policy and drug culture to one that puts people and planet first, and repairs the damages done by imperialistic drug prohibition.
Yeah, so maybe to like go in a little bit more on that damage. Thank you, Dom, for sharing that, and Jason for starting us off. I feel like there's maybe two things to add to this that will help frame this conversation for people. One is more macro and one is more micro level. So on a more general level, it's really helpful to remember that prohibition is actually the exception to the rule. So if you look throughout history and how countries and other states or communities or cultures have handled altered states, drugs, substances that can alter your state, etc., for most of human history, that was incorporated into a trade system. And of course, trade can exist with or without our modern form of economics, but the reality is that the access to substances that altered our mind or that had an effect in that way was part of trade. And it's interesting because in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the American drug policy started to shift toward prohibition, they actually had to push back against the Dutch and European and Dutch and English forces, which at the time had a lot of economic control and were very successfully trading things like opium. So there was actually this way where for a long time drugs were used as an economic tool and I would say drugs were used as part of this kind of imperialistic plan that Jason mentioned, this economic control, where like these external European powers gained control over resources and then traded them themselves. So when the US came around in the late 1800s, early 1900s saying, well, actually we want to prohibit all this, the people who were making money, which are also colonial powers, were like, wait a minute, we're making total bank off of this opium thing. Why don't we just do that? So it was actually a significant shift for drug policy to shift in the direction of what we now know as like kind of the American prohibition model, which has been hegemonic for the last 100 years. One good example of that, which was touched on, is just to get more to a specific example, is the fact that, and I actually learned this at an SSDP conference some years ago, that some of the original laws restricting and controlling cocaine and coca growth in Colombia were written in English by American policy people who were then translated and essentially forced onto Colombian policy people who now, if you look at the news, the Colombian government looks pretty willing to fumigate its own people. But it's very much out of this long-term coalition that was built between the US and the Colombian government in favor of this global drug policy strategy, which was made for this political class rather than the farmers who are actually being impacted by it. So there's a way that this like kind of framework that we're talking about creates this overarching model that then gets implemented in a lot of specific ways.
Yeah, thank you for framing it that way, Ismail. Unless anyone else wants to touch on that, I'm going to move us on to the next question. Jason?
Oh, I was just going to say, for me, I mean, it's really the linkage of the economic and the violence, right, combined, that we're going to make sure that our economic interests back home, we're going to be met, even if that means killing the people wherever we have to get our resources from. So when we think about how every facet of our community is enforced in these different ways, it's because there's always that threat of violence and that threat of poverty, like on everything. And so that's how imperialism kind of seeps into everything. But it's a structure of divide and conquer, just like racism, sexism, homophobia, all of those that we have to be continuously battling, even if we can't see it very clearly in front of us. But I think it's something that definitely affects every part of our life.
Definitely. It sounds to me like ending drug prohibition is part of a larger struggle, right, to address the legacy of colonialism and the harms caused by prohibition. With that, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about capitalism, right? How does that play into the drug policy movement when we're talking about imperialism and colonization?
Sure. The big question there is money, right? And so we have an economic system where we've made money scarce. And in order to purchase food, housing, and other necessities, we have to have this thing called money. And so when we deny communities the ability to generate their own food and housing and things like that, and then say they have to be indebted to us, right, the United States or our dollar, in order to get those basic things, now we have an economic exploitative relationship going on, right? Capitalism loves those relationships, right? Because there's no check on the amount of money somebody can make in a colonial situation, right? Like in Puerto Rico, the Walmarts in Puerto Rico are the most profitable Walmarts that there are in the world. And so colonialism is exploiting this ancient form of dominance and just saying, wow, this really fits in really well with what we're already trying to do. And so as we start to think about what is decriminalization and legalization and what does it look like to create a market for substances, right, we can't ignore that we're legalizing these substances into a capitalist system that benefits from imperialism, right? And so that is the context we're operating in, and we just have to understand that that is part of who we are as organizers. We have to deal with that all the time and make sure that the policies that we are pushing don't have unintended consequences later that may be more detrimental. But it is clear that when we start talking about legal markets of drugs and purchasing and selling things, corporations, international influence, and things like that are going to come into play.
Definitely. I think especially when we're talking in the context of legalization and decriminalization, right? The commercialization of plants is an inevitable outcome, right? And so I'm wondering if anyone here wants to touch a little bit about the cannabis industry and how that industry has been affected by colonial and imperialist practices.
So, yeah, absolutely, and well said, Jason. I think imperialism and capitalism are manifestations of an exploitive and extractive philosophy, and I think it's our job to develop a sustainable relationship with our planet and reorganize our economic system to prioritize working people. We need our drug policy movement and drug culture to reflect that. And our goal should be to eliminate profit or reduce it when it comes to drugs and advocate for social equity policies, which Jason can talk more about all day, I'm sure, and also public benefit corporations like you've seen with MAPS. We should as much as we can by fighting for decriminalization. But when it happens, and commodification will happen, we have to be prepared for that. And we have to, in essence, use plants to fund the revolution and by extension, repair the damages done, to the communities, the frontline communities who have been most impacted globally, and use the economic profits to help them. Cannabis profits and taxes can fund indemnification and reparations programs in countries and communities ravaged by imperialism and systemic oppression. Corporate cannabis will fight us on that. If you see what's going on in the United States, and I'm working on licenses here in Chicago, Illinois, where we just legalized and passed the most equity-centric legislation in the nation. But still, that social equity program is crumbs. Some $20 million were set aside for disproportionately impacted communities, but you're still seeing all these lobbyists and all these CEOs walking away with millions of dollars. And the people who've been most impacted, they're not really seeing the benefit yet of legalization. So when we talk about legalization, we have to ask ourselves, legalization for whom? For whom are we legalizing for? And as of yet, as I've been working on cannabis policy, I've only seen the benefits really for the rich, the white, and the entrenched power holders. So, when we talk about cannabis, because we have to start with cannabis, but I believe one day the conversation will move forward towards coca and cocaine and what that's going to look like on a global market and how we can use profits for that to rebuild what the drug war has done in Latin America. So on the policy front and within industries, we have to support, unionization of the cannabis industry. When we think about the global cannabis trade and, they're projecting 2 cents a gram in Colombia, and eventually we're gonna get all of our weed from Colombia. How do we make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes where you see the exploitation of labor and the farm workers? How do we make sure that there's not, death squads killing people who try to unionize when they're out working in the fields for 10, 14 hours a day? So I'll leave it there, but I can talk more about it.
Ismail, is there anything you want to add to that?
Jason looked like he wanted to add something, but if you're good, then
You can go first, and I'll follow up.
Okay. So this is such an interesting topic. I really appreciate what both of you said, and I'm glad that it's being linked because it's not obvious to a lot of people that like these like large, seemingly ancient systems of colonialism and imperialism are connected to our everyday reality of capitalism. You know, that's not something that's taken for granted by everyone, that's understood by everyone. So recognizing that that economic leverage that Jason was talking about, I think, is as a primary kind of crowbar, right, in ensuring that the system runs the way it should, is a pretty major factor. So when we're talking about bringing substances that are currently in an underground market, and I think that we have to first remember that these substances are already for sale in capitalist markets, right? They're in underground, unregulated markets, but they're very much for sale, and they very much exist in markets already. So what we're talking about here is actually adding regulatory systems that move the resources, whether they're the plants themselves or the money that comes out of them, into a certain place, right? And that's what the equity programs are attempting to do. But I agree, they're just a scratch of the surface of a much bigger issue. So getting down to it, I think about this on kind of a spectrum, because it's kind of, in some ways, I feel very lucky to be working in the psychedelic space, because we can see what's going on in cannabis and be like, ooh, that's not what we want to happen. How can we avoid that outcome? And what do we need to do? And can we do things? What can we do? What are we actually able to do? And I bring it up because I think that this seems to be an issue in my mind that will actually impact all of drug policy. So right now we're seeing with cannabis, or we have been seeing with cannabis, I should say, there's increasing conversation around whether or not psychedelics should be commercialized, how do they enter the market, is it just for them to enter a market that's bound by all of these realities that we're talking about here? I would go even further to say that, like, if we're talking about legal access to all drugs, or regulated access to all drugs, which is what a lot of people within the drug policy movement are holding out for, myself included, because of the social justice and civil rights implications of criminalization on one level, we're also talking about potentially incorporating companies to sell legal meth and heroin and cocaine and other things. And in my mind, when I'm thinking about whether it's psychedelics or cocaine or something else, whether or not it ends up in a market is one question. Whether or not it ends up in a market where, like, you can use advertising dollars and use psychology in the way that our online targeted advertising puts me in a much more skeptical position, where it's like, well, this isn't just trade. This isn't just like me buying from my guy who has a grow or whatever, which is like some form of capital exchange or trade, but it's not quite the same as giving, you know, the superstructure, the capitalist superstructure with all of its sleight of hand and illusion, the power to market something that does actually, like, that has both benefits and harms, right? That has complex effects on human systems and individuals. So kind of pulling back out a bit, it makes me wonder, like, well, what is the regulatory system that we're actually fighting for? And, you know, the question is, like, where do we end? Like, do we end at decrim? Do we end at legalization? What does medicalization have to do with it? I'm down, and happily, maybe at another time, like, we can get hours and hours into the philosophical value of any of these systems. But I think, practically speaking, like, the way that people's ability to engage right now, we can agree that engaging in the traditional market is biased and problematic in all these ways. But to Jason's point, even if we agree on that, that doesn't change the fact that people that are excluded from that market are disenfranchised in a way that is disproportionate even to that level. So there's a way where, like, we kind of have to play with the system so we can ensure that there's some level of coverage, right? Some level of access to enough people that maybe that can then turn into a larger wave. But it's really hard because, like, we're playing by rules that are set by the superstructure, right? But not by the individual, not by the farmers, not by the workers. So I think that there's a way where Dom's point's super important, because bringing in those, like, really worker-centric, people-centric policies within this, like, larger structure that we're talking about actually gives us an opportunity for there to be balance and parity between the negotiating that's happening to create an industry. Like, we agree, like, whether we agree or not, there's going to be an industry.
Right.
How does it look like? That's the question I think that we're kind of getting to.
I wonder if a Marxist would agree that we should be playing confines of the system. But I hear that. I hear that.
There's lots of arguments to be made that securing your own cultivation license is seizing the means of production in the 21st century, because we're going to have to figure out how do we replace the things we don't want with better economic systems. And so that's a conversation for another panel, I'll say. But when we're talking about equity, and what MCBA really pushes on equity a lot, is ensuring that the communities most impacted are able to benefit from the economic benefits of legalization. One of those, right? So the markets already exist. People are having commerce happen both on the smaller scale, and also big entities like the United States government uses our foreign policy to address all kinds of black market activities. And like we saw under Reagan, right? It's another thing for folks to Google another time. The Iran-Contra affair, it's a big one. But what we're seeing now, though, is a conversation of, okay, we admit that that was wrong. It was clearly racist. People have come on record and said that. How are we going to make sure that we're doing something to heal that damage in order to have a whole community? Right? Like, part of the reason we want equity is so that our communities can all be together and saying we're moving forward in a way that is beneficial and we're growing as a people. If we're imprisoning each other, we can't do that. And so this is equity, in my opinion, is first an admission that the other way of doing things is failed and it's not going to work for us, right? So in order to make it better, we try to inject economic opportunity, which was denied previously, very targetedly into certain communities. Now, as folks that are part of SSDP know, the war on drugs affects so many different facets of our lives. But I'll give an example of Colombia, because myself and Dom were lucky enough to be able to go there and speak and meet with the people there. And shout out to Carol Ortega, who is working with MCBA on a lot of our Latino organizing. But while we were there, we really got to see how important the discussion between the local cannabis farmers and the government was as part of the peace agreement for Colombia to end the civil war internally, right? Because there's an economic problem there where the farmers needed to pay their bills and provide housing and food for folks, and because of prohibition, the most profitable crops to grow are illegal, and so there was no way that those communities could agree to just stop growing those crops, right? So it had to be part of the agreement with the government that they'll be able to grow them. They'll have ownership over their farms, and they'll be able to export those products and be able to make a living for themselves, right? So right now, there's a very tenuous situation with the government not upholding its end of the bargain, where we're literally talking about cannabis, specifically, but drug equity being the defining feature of whether or not a country is stable, right? And that's where I think, as we start to look at the broader picture in the rest of the world, the United States has done things like that to every country in Latin America and just about every country in the world. But we have very specific things like Plan Colombia, right? Where we spent millions and millions of dollars to dump toxic waste and herbicides all over Colombia to supposedly try to wipe out the cocaine fields, killed lots of people, poisoned the land. And
present tense.
It's still happening, right?
Present tense.
100%, right? So when we can conceive of here in the States that giving someone economic opportunity is a payment for a wrong that created what happened in the past, how do we quantify that for Latin America? How do we quantify that for the rest of the world? Because that's what our job is as drug policy activists now, is to start to have that conversation, right? So for me, as MCBA, we definitely do a lot of stuff here in the States, but I want to start to have the conversation of what does social equity look like for the entire globe when we finally truly end the war on drugs. It's a monumental question, but I think it's what we've been called to do.
If I could add one more quick thing to that.
Yep.
Which is, so we talk a lot about economic equity, and that's so much of what MCBA and y'all have done for a long time. And I'm so grateful for the work, because I think it's created a really important blueprint for how I think we should be treating every substance that we legalize, for in different ways and different frameworks. But lately in the psychedelic space and at MAPS, we've been thinking a lot about the concept of health equity, because there's like the ways that economic power has been made inaccessible. And I think that that's linked, but also slightly separate from this idea of like access to healthcare and wellness, which is for sure related to economic empowerment, but also has to do with like the basics, like is the farm that your family subsides on for generations like being covered in toxic pesticides from American warplanes, questions like that. But I think in the US especially, we look at like discrepancies in access to healthcare, not just because of cost, but also because of cultural capacity and like actual willingness. For such a long time, like healthcare for poor people, non-white people, people who are considered highly marginalized and who are, was just not prioritized. And it really, really isn't until the last like 40 years that you're really starting to see change around that. And it's very slow, So when we're thinking about equity, I think looking at equity both from economic and from like a health, wellness, cultural perspective, I think helps round that out, especially when we're talking about substances that have cultural and traditional kind of practices built around them, which include cannabis, but for sure also the psychedelic substances and plants. So just wanted to add that because it's another angle.
I want to bring us back a bit to decolonization and decolonizing our drug use. And I appreciate everything that you just mentioned, Ismail. I'm wondering if each of you could tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about, why our movement needs to align itself with decolonization, principles of decolonization. Why is that important for equity? Why is that important? Maybe we can start off with Dom.
Sure. You know, I think it's vitally important to recognize that we are community organizers for the drug policy reform movement wherever we are, in our institutions, in our workplaces, in our Ubers, in our Lyfts, on the bus, on the L. You know, every moment that we can talk about this in a global perspective, we should, because that's how we change the world. We are worker bees who are pollinating little flowers all over, and that's how we win. So I think it's important to decolonize our own minds. And, you know, what does that mean? Whether it's, you know, recognizing that we've been conditioned under very white supremacist terms, patriarchy, those kinds of things, nationalism. It's just learning about all these things, which is a privilege. Like this, we as students are able to learn about all these things, these very complex issues, and you know, have the responsibility to share that knowledge and to do something with that knowledge. And, you know, I would even reframe what the question is to, you know, what my woke mentor, Jay Ortiz, calls cultural imperialism. How do we as young people and people in the drug policy reform movement combat cultural imperialism? And I think it's vitally important to decolonize our movements by putting the people who've been most impacted in power, amplifying their voices. Now more than ever, we need intersectional activists, centering the stories and the perspectives of people of color, of people who've been locked up for this, of people who've had their land taken away from this, who've lost family members for this, and collaborating with multicultural organizations, Black and Brown coalitions, indigenous groups, organizations fighting for civil rights and human rights, because their fight is our fight. So if we are able to invite them to go into their spaces and invite them to ours, you know, that is how we build a social movement and shift culture and values to end the war on drugs. Because we talk about all these high level concepts, but we have to be willing to work locally and organize in whatever capacity to collaborate on different kind of events and build power to move forward. So if you have privilege, if you have race privilege, class privilege, gender privilege, use it. Right. Use it to fight imperialism and white supremacy and stigmatization of drug use any chance you get. Whether you're at a party and someone calls someone a crackhead, you know, say something. Radical, nonviolent direct action. I think we're in a moment right now where our economic system is failing so many people. You know, during these times right now and the virus, I think people are really recognizing that the need for a change in tactics is so necessary. So I think you're going to see an increase in protests, in nonviolent direct actions, and the people with privilege need to put their bodies on the line and be willing to be part of something larger than themselves for the greater good. Civil disobedience in the drug policy reform movement is what I've been calling for a really long time, and I think you're going to start to see that as it starts to impact more people. So
yeah, even you know, violent, right, acts in this time, right? When food becomes more scarce, who knows what's going to happen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jason, you know, why else, you know, is it important for our movement to align itself with principles of decolonization?
In part because it makes us more powerful, right? And we need a lot of powerful people that are decolonized, ready to mobilize in order to address anything at the scale we're talking about. You know, but there's this old phrase from the 60s and 70s is you have to kill the policeman in your head, right? Because one of the things that happens is when we ask each other, what are we going to do? Right? The question of what can we do? How can we address this comes in, and it's a matter of how much confidence do we have in ourselves to be able to pull things off, right? So, but as we start to grow into larger groups and bigger groups and bigger groups. The only way we're going to be able to stick together is if we ensure that the ways we're organizing make people stronger and help each other become better organizers as we go, right? And so right now, the current structures that are in place over all of us, right, are not there to make us better organizers or better people, right? They're there to extract resources from us for others. So we have to just know that the current way of doing things is not the best way of doing it. So I think once we start to see all the ways that colonialism and imperialism affect just our daily lives and what we do, it's very, very similar to when you realize how many different things are affected by the war on drugs. Once you start to see that, right, it's almost like you have a bigger scope and a bigger frame to understand how to undo the different machinations that are currently out there. So I think it's important as an individual to do that, but also in order to defeat colonial structures, we need to come up with something new, something better, something different that's more effective, more strategic. And I don't think always, just more intense or more people. Like, we have to really talk about the strategy and efficiency of what we're doing, because it's not going to be sufficient to just yell louder. We have to be able to be powerful. And I think there's a big difference between being right and think we're right and being powerful. And I think by decolonizing our movements and decolonizing our organizations, we start to really make them powerful, which is more important.
Thank you so much for that. What about you, Ismail?
I can add just a quick thing onto that. I know we're running out of time, but on the power factor, I think that's really critical, not just because it's like good for us as a political movement, but it's actually in alignment with like what we're actually fighting for. So just quick example, like people may have heard this, I say this a lot. People ask a lot, like, how can like people within the psychedelic space, like how can we make it more intersectional or bring more people in? Like, how do we make it more attractive for other brown people and other Black people to join XYZ? And I mean, there's lots of answers to that question, but I can say that the first starting point is realizing that a lot of the time we're not really just talking about psychedelics. I like to say that psychedelics are like the sparkly rainbow gate into the shadow, right? And into the trauma, and like looking at the issues that we're actually working with, like psychedelics and cannabis and drugs. Of course, like what we're talking about is about those substances, but we all know as SSD peers that it's not really just about the substances, it's about the people. And looking at it from that people-centric perspective gives us some chance to see that the substances are just another tool when they're leveraged through prohibition in a way that actually impacts people in a negative way. So I think that it really just comes down to making sure that there is that space for not just like us trying to get people into our movement, but like Jason and Dom said, like showing up in those other places because we are actually connected more than we might immediately think.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like us to move into the last part of the conversation, which is going to focus on SSDP and our network. And so I have two different questions. Firstly, when we're reimagining what organizing looks like on an international level, how does SSDP need to change in order to better position itself to combat imperialism?
With MCBA, we're actually starting to explore hosting an international assembly of Latin American countries to talk about cannabis equity. And so we were hoping to do it in person at first. It's not going to happen. So now we have to do it digitally, which is changing our entire understanding and approach to organizing that maybe for the much better. So, first of all, like language is super, super important, right? And so being able to have folks that can translate documents or do your best you can to have live translations for events. A lot can be lost in translation. So it's very important that we're very kind and direct with each other when things aren't clear. But I also think we have to start figuring out how can we allow folks to participate in asynchronous ways, right? So that it's not everybody has to be at this one time in this one place with this one format, and you have to own a computer and all of this, right? So we have to think both like how are folks going to communicate with each other, but also the way we're operating now in the United States is a very corporate-centered way of doing things, even in the nonprofit space, right? We have meetings, we have very hierarchical moderators and all that good stuff. So I think the more that we can start to ask Latin American countries, other countries, how do you run meetings? How do you appreciate facilitation, right? And I think that is step one. So when folks always ask me, like, how do I learn more about Puerto Rico? I'm like, well, go and like see it and actually like visit it, but meet people that are doing good work and ask them what they need. And they'll tell you very clearly. And so I think for us, being able to really document that, taking information from other movements that are doing it effectively. There are other movements that are trying to do the same thing. The climate change movement is a clear example where we're all in this together, and we need to figure out how we can talk across borders. And I think, you know, re-examining just basic facilitation, right? How do we make sure folks are able to access it, right? Disability access is another concern there. And then also, are we asking the folks that we're trying to bring in how they would like to be brought in? I think that's a really important piece. And lastly, of course, like when they tell you what's wrong, you got to listen and actually address it, right? Like, because sometimes we're told over and over again how you could do it, and we don't take that next move because it's more costly or what it may be. But I think at this moment, for all of our orgs, SSDP especially, but many organizations, we have to understand prioritization of what we want to do, and that the way forward for all of us is an international scope. And so we have to retool how we do things and what is a priority to address our new reality.
I can jump onto that. Like that new reality aspect is super real. So SST was founded over 20 years ago, and the audience for drug policy reform has changed in the United States significantly over the last years, and it's really so much in the last 5 years or so as criminal justice reform has gotten more bipartisan. That shift has really impacted how I think drug policy organizations in the US in general need to operate. And I think I'll just share like this one concept, which is what I've been calling cosmology switching, which is kind of like code switching, but for like whole cosmologies, where, you know, people come for a very long time. I feel like if people were coming to the drug policy reform movement, you can make some assumptions about why they were coming to it, about where their origin story may have started. And of course, there's infinite variations of that, but the drug policy reform movement is mainstream or accessible to the mainstream now in a way that it's never been before, which means that the people who are entering it are broadening, that there's more diversity of experience in the space. That's partially because it's become safer to become a drug policy advocate than it may have been 20 years ago, which is why I think you see more people with marginalized identities standing up, because it's not just like them in a sea of nothingness. There's organizations that are able to show up in that way. So I think when it comes to cosmology switching and being aware of your audience, to me, that really just comes down to, for SSDP, and I think a lot of organizations, being aware that there's no